My parents kicked me out for my sister, so I bought the house and became their landlord, and then, when my father called me into the living room, I already had a feeling something was coming, but I never expected him to tell me to pack my things and move out because my younger sister needed my room. The way he said it, as if it was a completely reasonable request and not a blatant dismissal of everything I had contributed to this household, made my stomach tighten. My mother stood beside him, shifting uncomfortably, her hands clasped together like she wanted to object, but had already decided it wasn't worth the argument. He barely looked at me when he spoke, his voice carrying that familiar tone of finality, as if this was a foregone conclusion and not a discussion. Jasmine needs space for her business, and since she's going to be running everything from home, she needs an actual office, not just a makeshift setup in her room. He crossed his arms, waiting for me to object, waiting for me to argue, waiting for me to cause the kind of problem he always accused me of avoiding. You have until Friday to get your things out. For a moment, I just stood there, absorbing the weight of his words, trying to decide if I should react the way he expected me to or if I should just let him think he had won. My laptop sat open on the desk in my bedroom, the glow from my bank's confirmation email still fresh in my mind. Less than an hour ago, I had finalized the purchase of this very house at a foreclosure auction, making me the legal owner of the home they were now kicking me out of. If they had taken even a second to consider my place in this family, they might have noticed I was no longer the quiet, compliant son they thought they could push around. I heard you, I finally replied, my voice perfectly neutral as I closed my laptop, making sure none of my expression betrayed the storm of thoughts racing through my mind. I'll start packing tomorrow. My father gave me a single approving nod, clearly relieved that I wasn't fighting back, already eager to be done with the conversation so he could get back to whatever he had been doing before he decided to upend my life. He walked away without another word, disappearing into his study as if he had just handled an administrative task and not essentially disowned his oldest son. Minutes later, Jasmine came bouncing into my room, her usual burst of energy on full display, her excitement completely uncontained, as if she wasn't taking over the space I had lived in for years but had just won some kind of prize she had always deserved. Her hair was styled in effortless waves, her manicured fingers already swiping through color palettes on her phone as she barely glanced up to acknowledge me. "I'm thinking of painting these walls taupe," she announced, her tone filled with so much enthusiasm that I almost wanted to let her continue without interruption, just to see how far she would go with her plans before she realized how completely they were about to fall apart. "It'll look perfect on camera for my brand. Super professional, but also warm and inviting. Oh, and I'm getting a custom desk made, something sleek, but not too corporate looking." She finally looked up, studying my face, searching for any sign of resistance, any reason to launch into a self-righteous speech about how she was following her dreams, and I should be supportive instead of sulking. "You're not mad, are you?" I looked around the room that had been mine since childhood, taking in the bookshelves filled with years of carefully curated knowledge, the window seat where I had spent countless hours reading, the walls that had once held posters of bands I had long since outgrown. This was the space where I had built the foundation of my life, where I had quietly invested in real estate, while everyone else assumed I was just a low-level financial analyst with no real ambition. While Jasmine burned through our parents' savings on failed ventures, a yoga studio that barely lasted 6 months, an organic smoothie bar that never made it past its grand opening, a wellness blog that turned into nothing but credit card debt, I had been silently growing a property portfolio that now included a dozen rental properties across the city. This house would be lucky number 13. "Taupe sounds nice," I said, keeping my voice even, giving her absolutely nothing to react to. She hesitated for half a second, clearly expecting a different response, then shrugged and went back to her phone, already lost in the fantasy of her new workspace. "Mom and Dad think this is the best move for everyone," she added, her voice turning just slightly defensive, as if she was aware, on some level, that what they were doing was wrong but had already convinced herself it was justified. "You're good with budgets and stuff, so you'll find a place fast, right?" It was almost impressive, The way she had managed to make herself the victim in this situation. The way she had twisted the narrative so that I was the one being unreasonable for even hesitating. She had spent her entire life being told that she was special, that she had potential, that her ideas were worth investing in, and she had never once stopped to consider that she had failed at every single one of them. "Don't worry about me," I said, giving her the same easy tone I had used all my life, the one that kept the peace, the one that let everyone believe I was fine with whatever they decided. "I'll figure something out." Later that evening, I sat at the dinner table with my parents, pushing my food around my plate, pretending to listen as my mother tried to soften the situation with carefully chosen words that still made it clear there was no room for negotiation. "We know this is sudden," she said, offering me a sympathetic look that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But Jasmine really needs this opportunity. Her coaching business could be the thing that finally takes off, and having the right space will make all the difference." I glanced at my father, who didn't even look up from his plate as he cut into his steak with the same detachment he had when discussing household repairs. "It's time for you to get out on your own anyway," he added, as if I hadn't been contributing to this household for years, as if I hadn't covered the mortgage last year when he and Mom came up short, as if I hadn't paid for countless repairs that they had conveniently forgotten about. "Maybe this will push you to do something more with your life instead of sitting at a desk all day." I let the words wash over me, absorbing their ignorance, their complete lack of awareness about who I was and what I had accomplished. "Maybe," I said simply, taking a sip of water, already imagining the looks on their faces when they found out the truth. The next morning, I sat by my bedroom window, sipping my coffee, watching as Jasmine directed two guys from her gym to start moving furniture into what she believed would be her new office. She stood outside, arms crossed, her oversized sunglasses perched on top of her head, talking about lighting angles and backdrops as if she were already a highly successful entrepreneur instead of someone who had left a string of failed businesses in her wake. My father supervised half-heartedly, standing on the porch with his hands in his pockets, giving occasional nods of approval, clearly proud that his youngest daughter was finally taking the next step in what he still considered to be her inevitable success. My mother hovered near the front door, looking somewhat guilty but not guilty enough to actually say anything, occasionally checking her phone as if she was trying to avoid looking at me through the window. None of them even glanced in my direction, too wrapped up in their own self-congratulatory delusion to realize that their reality was already beginning to crack beneath them. My phone buzzed on my desk, the screen lighting up with a message from Vanessa, who had been my lawyer for the past 3 years and had guided me through every real estate purchase I had made. "The paperwork is officially being processed," her text read, short and efficient as always. "We can serve the lease agreements on Friday as planned." The timing could not have been more perfect, considering my father had given me until Friday to be completely out of the house. I typed a quick response, keeping it just as simple as hers, knowing she appreciated efficiency more than unnecessary details. Perfect timing. "They just told me I have until Friday to move out." Within seconds, her response popped up on my screen. "Do you want me to be there when they find out?" I leaned back in my chair, watching as Jasmine excitedly gestured toward my bedroom window, already envisioning how she would set up her filming equipment in the space she hadn't even officially taken yet. I knew my family well enough to anticipate exactly how they would react, and I wanted to make sure everything was handled professionally, with no room for them to manipulate the situation to their advantage. "Yes," I replied without hesitation, already picturing the moment everything would come crashing down around them. "Come by around 6. That's when my father usually gets home." Over the next 2 days, I continued to pack my personal belongings, carefully placing my books into labeled boxes, making sure to take everything of actual value while leaving behind anything that had no sentimental or financial worth. My parents barely acknowledged my presence, too focused on helping Jasmine set up her new workspace, which had now expanded beyond just my bedroom and into parts of the living room, where she insisted she needed an open, creative area for brainstorming and relaxation. She had convinced them to let her order a new couch, a sleek white one that would look aesthetically pleasing on camera, even though she still hadn't made a single dollar from any of her ventures. My mother had spent the majority of the afternoon helping her pick out office decorations, while my father spent an absurd amount of time mounting a giant whiteboard onto my bedroom wall, completely unaware that everything he was doing would be undone in less than 48 hours. That evening, as I was grabbing a glass of water from the kitchen, I overheard their conversation from the dining room, their voices carrying just enough for me to catch every word without them realizing I was listening. My mother's tone was soft, as if she was trying to justify something she already felt guilty about, but was determined to go through with anyway. "Sarah seems to be taking it well, don't you think?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it any louder would make it untrue. My father didn't even hesitate before responding, his voice firm with that unwavering certainty he always carried whenever he believed he was making a logical decision. "She understands this is for the best. It's time for her to move out and start doing something more with her life instead of sitting at that desk all day." Jasmine let out a small laugh, the kind of casual, dismissive sound that made it clear she had never once considered the possibility that she might not actually deserve all the things she had been given. "She'll be fine. She always is." I leaned against the counter, gripping the glass in my hand, the weight of their words pressing down on me with a familiar heaviness that I had carried for years. They had spent so much time convincing themselves that I was the reliable one, the one who didn't need help, the one who would always figure things out, that they had never stopped to consider that maybe I deserved the same level of support they so effortlessly handed to Jasmine. They had no idea that while they were dismissing me, while they were stripping me of my space and pushing me toward an imaginary fresh start, I had already secured my place in this house in a way they would never see coming. On Thursday night, I double-checked the final documents Vanessa had sent over, ensuring that every detail was in place, that every clause was clear, that there was absolutely no loophole for them to argue their way out of. She had outlined everything in a way that was both fair and legally airtight, offering them below-market rent with reasonable terms, making it impossible for them to claim that I was being vindictive or unreasonable. The numbers were clear, the conditions were firm, and the power they thought they had over me was already slipping through their fingers. As I closed my laptop, my mind drifted back to Jasmine's voice, the way she had laughed so easily earlier, the way she had spoken about me as if I was some disposable part of the family, someone whose existence was secondary to her ambitions. I could already imagine the look on her face when she realized the walls she had been so eager to paint taupe no longer belonged to her. I could picture my father's reaction when he realized that the daughter he had dismissed as nothing more than an office worker had outmaneuvered him in his own home. My mother's tears were inevitable, her desperate attempts to appeal to my emotions already predictable, but none of it would change the facts. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just reacting to their decisions. I wasn't just silently accepting the way things had always been. I was the one making the choices now, and whether they realized it or not, their entire reality was about to shift in ways they had never anticipated. Tomorrow, everything would change. By the time Friday evening arrived, the house was already starting to feel different, as if it no longer belonged to me, even though, in reality, it had never belonged to anyone else. Jasmine had fully moved into my old bedroom, rearranging the furniture to fit her vision of a successful entrepreneur's workspace, completely oblivious to the fact that within the next hour, her empire would collapse before it could even begin. My father had spent most of the afternoon in his study, acting as though he had already moved on from the inconvenience of having an adult son still living at home, completely unaware that I was about to dismantle every assumption he had ever made about me. My mother, as always, floated between pretending everything was fine and subtly checking in on me, her guilt creeping into the edges of her voice, but never strong enough to make her question the choices she and my father had made. When Vanessa's car pulled into the driveway, I didn't even have to look at the clock to know that my father would be home within minutes, just as planned. I opened the door before she could knock, her presence already adding an air of authority to the situation that my family was entirely unprepared for. She was dressed in the kind of sharp, polished suit that made it clear she meant business, her briefcase held firmly at her side, her expression calm but unreadable. The second my mother saw her standing in the doorway, her entire face shifted, the discomfort settling in before she even had the chance to process what was happening. "Sarah, who is this?" she asked, her voice already hesitant, as if she had just sensed the first crack in the foundation of the reality she had constructed for herself. Vanessa extended her hand with a professionalism that only made my mother more nervous, the tightness in her shoulders betraying the fact that she already knew, on some level, that whatever was happening would not be in her favor. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Vanessa, Sarah's attorney. Is your husband home yet? We have some important documents to discuss regarding your living situation." The shift in my mother's expression was instant, her entire body stiffening at the word attorney, her mind undoubtedly racing through every possible scenario that could explain why I would need legal representation in a conversation about my own eviction. Jasmine appeared in the hallway, holding a cup of tea in one hand and her phone in the other, her relaxed demeanor a stark contrast to my mother's growing unease. She barely glanced up from whatever message she was typing before she sighed, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "What's going on? I'm kind of in the middle of something important." The irony of her statement nearly made me laugh, considering she was likely sending a message about ring lights or social media aesthetics rather than anything remotely significant. Before I could answer, my father's car pulled into the driveway, his presence the final piece of the puzzle that needed to be in place before I could reveal what was about to happen. As soon as my father stepped through the door, he took one look at Vanessa and immediately turned to me, his expression darkening with suspicion, his voice sharp with irritation. "What is this?" he demanded, his eyes flicking between me and my lawyer, as if trying to piece together a puzzle he hadn't even realized existed. Who is she, and why is she here? I had spent my entire life choosing my words carefully, making sure to phrase things in a way that would minimize conflict. But tonight, I had no intention of softening the blow. I reached into Vanessa's briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope, my fingers pressing against the crisp edges of the documents that would permanently change the dynamic of this household. I took a step forward, watching as my father's confidence faltered for the first time, his authority slipping through his grasp before he even understood why. 3 weeks ago, I found the foreclosure notice in your study, I said, keeping my voice steady, refusing to let the weight of this moment shake me. The one you didn't tell us about. The one that explained how you remortgaged this house beyond what you could afford, using every last bit of available credit to fund Jasmine's businesses. I could hear my mother's sharp intake of breath, the unsteady rustling of Jasmine's silk robe as she shifted uncomfortably beside me, but I kept my focus on my father, refusing to let him look away. This morning, the sale was finalized. I bought this house at the foreclosure auction. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick and unmoving, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of what I had just said. My father's face drained of color so quickly that, for a brief moment, I thought he might actually collapse under the weight of his own failure. My mother's hands flew to her mouth, her body swaying slightly, as if her mind was struggling to process the implications of what I had just revealed. Jasmine, however, was the first to break the silence, her voice cracking with disbelief, her nails digging into the sleeve of my mother's sweater as if looking for stability in the middle of a free fall. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, the denial clinging to her words like a lifeline. "You're lying. This is some kind of joke." Vanessa, ever the professional, stepped forward and pulled out another set of papers, her voice calm but firm as she held them out toward my father. "This is the updated deed, showing Sarah as the legal owner of the property," she said, her tone carrying no room for argument. "Additionally, these are the lease agreements outlining the terms of residency should you choose to remain in the home." My father didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink as he stared at the papers in Vanessa's hand, his entire body frozen in a state of disbelief so complete that, for the first time in my life, he looked truly lost. My mother let out a small, broken sound, her hands shaking as she reached for the documents, her fingers skimming the edges as if touching them would somehow change their contents. Jasmine, on the other hand, refused to accept any of it, her face twisting with a mixture of rage and panic, her voice rising in pitch with every desperate word. "You can't do this. This is our home. You can't just take it away from us like this." I turned to face her, meeting her wild-eyed stare with the kind of unwavering certainty that came from years of being underestimated, years of being dismissed, years of knowing that this moment was inevitable. "No," I corrected, my voice steady, unshaken by her outburst. "This was our home. Now, it's my property, and you all have a choice to make." My father finally found his voice, though it was weaker than I had ever heard it before, the confidence stripped from him entirely, leaving nothing but exhaustion in its place. "You really did this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he already knew the answer but couldn't quite bring himself to accept it. I didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, didn't give him a single opportunity to regain the upper hand. "Yes," I said, making sure he understood that this was not a negotiation, not something he could manipulate to his advantage. "And now you have two options: sign the lease and stay, or find somewhere else to live. Either way, I'm moving back into my room on Monday." For the first time in my life, I watched as my father, the man who had always held control over every aspect of this family, realized he no longer had any control at all. The weekend after I revealed my ownership of the house was filled with a suffocating silence that settled over everything like a thick fog, making every interaction in the house feel strained and unnatural. My father barely spoke, retreating into his study as if locking himself away would somehow allow him to avoid the reality that had been forced upon him, while my mother spent most of her time cleaning obsessively, her way of coping with things she couldn't control. Jasmine, on the other hand, had taken the complete opposite approach, locking herself in what was still technically my bedroom and refusing to move her belongings back to her old space, as if her stubbornness alone could somehow undo everything that had already been set in stone. She hadn't spoken directly to me since Friday night, but I could hear her on the phone throughout the day, loudly complaining to her friends about how I had betrayed the family and ruined her business, conveniently leaving out the part where I had saved the house she had nearly cost them. I had chosen to stay in a hotel for the weekend, giving them space to process everything without the added tension of my presence, knowing that they needed to come to terms with reality before I could fully reclaim the space that was now legally mine. Vanessa had advised me not to move back in until the lease agreements were signed, reminding me that no matter how much control I had over the situation, the transition would be smoother if they felt like they had some say in the matter. "They're in shock right now," she had said over coffee that morning, her tone calm, but firm in the way it always was when she wanted to make sure I understood the weight of my decisions. "Your father's pride is wounded, your mother is scrambling to keep the family together, and your sister is watching her fantasy collapse in real time. Give them space to let it sink in, but make it clear that their options haven't changed." By Sunday afternoon, I received the message I had been waiting for, a short text from my mother that read, "Please come home. We need to talk." I sat in my hotel room for several minutes before responding, letting the weight of the request settle over me, knowing that whatever conversation was waiting for me at that house would be one they had rehearsed a dozen times before deciding on the version they thought had the best chance of convincing me to change my mind. Vanessa had warned me that they would likely attempt to appeal to my emotions, reminding me that guilt had always been their most effective tool against me, and I needed to be prepared to set firm boundaries without letting them pull me back into old patterns. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the atmosphere inside the house felt different, not just tense but carefully controlled, as if they had spent the entire day trying to present a unified front, hoping to wear me down with a performance rather than an honest conversation. My mother stood by the window, her hands wringing together as if she were bracing herself for an argument she didn't want to have, while my father sat in his usual spot on the couch, a thick stack of papers sitting in front of him, evidence that he had finally forced himself to confront the financial disaster he had been avoiding for months. Jasmine sat curled in the armchair across from him, her red-rimmed eyes suggesting she had either been crying or fuming in frustration, though knowing her, it was likely a combination of both. "We've been talking," my mother started hesitantly, her voice softer than usual, as if she thought lowering her tone would make me more receptive to what she was about to say. "About everything, about the way things have happened, about the decisions that led us to this point. And we feel blindsided." My father exhaled sharply through his nose at that, his bitterness slipping through before he could fully suppress it, shaking his head slightly as he finally met my gaze for the first time in days. "All this time, we thought you were just working that finance job, just doing your usual routine, and now we find out you were planning this behind our backs?" His tone wasn't accusatory so much as wounded, as if the real betrayal wasn't that they had nearly lost their home, but that I had outmaneuvered them without them realizing it. I let out a quiet breath, already exhausted by the way they were framing this, as if my financial planning and long-term investments were some kind of personal attack rather than a means of protecting myself from their recklessness. "I didn't plan this," I corrected, keeping my voice steady despite the frustration bubbling beneath my skin. "I didn't secretly plot to take the house from you. I didn't manipulate anything behind your backs, and I certainly didn't push you into foreclosure. I saw what was happening. I saw that you were about to lose everything because you refused to acknowledge reality, and I made the only choice that would keep this house in the family." Jasmine let out a sharp scoff at that, rolling her eyes so hard it was a miracle she didn't give herself whiplash, her bitterness practically radiating off of her in waves. "Oh, please," she snapped, her voice dripping with disdain as she gestured wildly toward me. "You didn't do this out of some noble sense of duty to the family. You did this to prove a point, to hold it over our heads, to feel powerful for once in your life." I turned to face her fully, meeting her glare with a calmness that only made her angrier, knowing that no matter how much she lashed out, she couldn't change the facts. "If I wanted to hold it over your heads, I wouldn't have offered you a lease at below-market rent with fair terms," I said, watching as her expression flickered with uncertainty for just a second before she masked it with another eye roll. "If I wanted revenge, I would have evicted you the second the papers were finalized, instead of giving you the option to stay. The truth is, you don't care about this house. You care about what you thought you were getting from it. You wanted an office, a set for your videos, a space to play pretend while everyone else kept covering for your failures. Now, for the first time, you're being asked to take responsibility for something, and you can't handle it." My father cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with how quickly the conversation had escalated, glancing down at the lease agreement in front of him as if looking at the numbers again would somehow change them. "The terms are fair," he admitted gruffly, his voice reluctant, but honest in a way he had rarely been before. "More than fair, actually." My mother reached out and placed her hand over his, her fingers curling slightly as if trying to anchor herself in the moment. "We just never imagined you were capable of all this," she whispered, her voice filled with something that almost sounded like regret, but not quite. "We never saw you as anything more than." She cut herself off before she could finish, but I already knew exactly what she had been about to say, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to fight for their validation. "You never saw me at all," I finished for her, my voice softer than before, but no less certain. "But that's not my problem anymore." By Sunday evening, the lease agreements had been signed, though not without a final round of passive-aggressive resistance that made it painfully clear my family still hadn't fully accepted the shift in power. My father had spent nearly an hour reviewing every clause as if he might uncover some hidden loophole that would allow him to regain control, only to finally admit, through gritted teeth, that the terms were more generous than anything they would find elsewhere. My mother had sighed deeply as she signed her name, her reluctance etched into every movement, as if putting pen to paper somehow made this entire situation more real than she was prepared to handle. Jasmine, unsurprisingly, had refused to sign anything herself, insisting that she shouldn't have to because she was just living with mom and dad, as if that would somehow exempt her from the reality that she was, for the first time, residing in a home that didn't belong to her parents. I had returned to the house early Monday morning, fully prepared to move back into my bedroom and reclaim the space that had been mine long before Jasmine decided it was the perfect setting for her next business failure. When I walked through the front door, I wasn't surprised to find her sitting in the middle of the living room, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression twisted into something between resentment and barely contained frustration. She had already moved her things out of my room, though not without making a production of it, leaving behind an open can of taupe paint on the floor as some sort of last-minute attempt to claim ownership over a space that had never belonged to her. As I stepped past her without a word, heading toward the staircase, she let out an exaggerated sigh, clearly determined to provoke some kind of response. "You know, you could have just let me keep it," she said, her voice dripping with forced nonchalance, though the tension in her jaw gave her away completely. "It's not like you even needed the space. You're just doing this to prove a point, not because you actually care." I paused at the base of the stairs, turning slowly to face her, letting her see that I wasn't going to be baited into an argument that she had already lost. "I bought this house because I saw the foreclosure notice that you didn't," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger simmering beneath my calm exterior. "I stepped in and took responsibility when our parents were too busy pretending everything was fine to actually fix their own mistakes. You can tell yourself whatever story helps you sleep at night, but the truth is, you were never entitled to my room, this house, or any of the sacrifices other people made to support you." For the first time since this entire situation had unfolded, she didn't immediately snap back with some self-righteous defense, instead pressing her lips together so tightly they almost disappeared. I didn't wait for her to come up with another excuse, another way to twist reality in her favor, because I had wasted enough time entertaining her delusions. Without another word, I turned and walked up the stairs, leaving her sitting there in the wreckage of her own entitlement, finally forced to confront the reality she had spent years ignoring. As I unpacked my things and settled back into my bedroom, I could hear my parents moving around downstairs, their voices lower than usual, their movements slower, as if the weight of everything was finally starting to settle in. My father had spent the better part of the morning in his study, likely trying to convince himself that he still had some measure of control over the situation, while my mother had taken to avoiding direct conversation with me, clearly unsure of how to navigate the new dynamic that she had never expected to exist. The tension in the house was different now, less combative but heavier, like they had all finally realized that this wasn't just some temporary inconvenience that would pass if they ignored it long enough. Around noon, my mother knocked softly on my bedroom door, hovering uncertainly in the doorway, her expression hesitant in a way that I had rarely seen before. I gestured for her to come in, watching as she sat carefully on the edge of the window seat, her hands folded in her lap, as if she was struggling to figure out where to begin. "I've been thinking about everything," she started, her voice quieter than usual, her gaze focused on the floor rather than on me. "About how we treated you compared to Jasmine, about all the times we made excuses for her while expecting you to just handle everything on your own." I leaned back against my desk, crossing my arms as I studied her, waiting to see if this was a real moment of self-awareness or just another attempt to smooth things over without actually addressing the deeper issues. "And," I prompted, keeping my tone neutral but firm, unwilling to let this conversation turn into another half-hearted apology that meant nothing. She sighed, rubbing her hands together as if trying to warm them, her discomfort evident in every movement. "We took you for granted," she admitted, finally lifting her gaze to meet mine, her eyes slightly glassy with unshed tears. "We assumed that because you were responsible and independent, you didn't need our support the way Jasmine did. We convinced ourselves that we were doing the right thing, that we were just helping her find her path, but in reality, we were enabling her while pushing you aside." I didn't say anything immediately, letting her words hang between us, letting her sit with the weight of them instead of rushing to comfort her the way I might have in the past. "I didn't need your support," I said finally, my voice measured, refusing to let emotion cloud the truth. "But I did deserve your respect." She nodded quickly, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her sweater, as if she was holding on to it to keep herself from breaking down completely. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And I'm sorry. I just, I never imagined you were capable of all this, of building something so solid while we were too busy chasing dreams that weren't even ours to begin with." I let out a slow breath, not quite ready to forgive, but also not entirely closed off to the idea that, maybe, with time, things could be different. "That's the problem," I said, standing up and walking toward the window, looking out over the yard that had once been a symbol of childhood but now felt like something entirely new. "You never imagined I could be more than what you decided I was." She was quiet for a long time, and when she finally stood to leave, she hesitated in the doorway, glancing back at me with something unreadable in her expression. "We're having dinner together tonight," she said, her tone careful, as if she was afraid I might refuse. "Just as a family, no discussions about the lease, no arguments, just dinner." I considered it for a moment, weighing the offer against everything that had happened, before giving her a small nod. "I'll be there," I said, watching as a flicker of relief passed over her face before she quickly masked it, retreating down the hall without another word. As I stood there, listening to the distant murmur of my parents' voices downstairs and the sound of Jasmine angrily tapping away on her phone, likely venting to whatever audience still cared to listen, I realized that, for the first time in years, I didn't feel like an afterthought in my own home. I wasn't just the reliable one, the one who always landed on their feet, the one who could be pushed aside whenever it was convenient. I had made a choice, taken control, and forced them to see me in a way they never had before. And no matter how much they struggled to adjust, that was never going to change. By the time a full week had passed, the house no longer felt like the same place I had grown up in, not because I had reclaimed my room or because the lease agreements had been signed, but because the unspoken rules that had governed this family for years had been shattered beyond repair. My parents were still adjusting to the reality that they were now my tenants rather than the heads of the household, but at least they had begun making changes, however reluctantly. My father, who once dismissed anything that didn't fit his narrow definition of success, had finally started paying attention to his finances, spending more time reviewing budgets than sulking in his study. My mother, always the mediator, had taken a step back from trying to smooth things over and instead focused on managing household expenses, as if acknowledging that their old way of doing things had led them to disaster. But Jasmine was still fighting it with every ounce of delusion she had left. She barely spoke to me unless it was absolutely necessary, moving through the house as if she were a wrongfully convicted prisoner rather than someone who had nearly caused her parents to lose their home. She had refused to contribute to rent, had refused to acknowledge any fault in the situation, and had instead decided to cast herself as the tragic victim of a family obsessed with money over dreams. I had caught glimpses of her social media posts, vague statements about toxic people who don't support your vision, and learning to thrive even when those closest to you try to hold you back. She hadn't mentioned me by name, but she didn't need to. Anyone with common sense could see exactly what she was trying to do. I ignored it. I had already won, and I had no interest in engaging with someone who still refused to live in reality. That was, until I came home late one evening to find her sitting at the kitchen table, stacks of papers spread out in front of her, her usual air of self-importance replaced with something closer to frustration. The moment she saw me, she sighed dramatically, as if my very existence had made her life more difficult, then gestured toward the mess of documents in front of her. "Since you're such a genius when it comes to money, maybe you can explain why the bank rejected my loan application," she said, her voice sharp with irritation, as if I had somehow personally intervened to sabotage her. I set my keys down on the counter, glancing at the paperwork, instantly recognizing the glaringly obvious reason she had been denied. "You have no steady income," I said, my voice matter of fact, refusing to sugarcoat reality for her when it was clear no one else had ever bothered to tell her the truth. "You have no proof of earnings, no savings, and your credit score is barely above disaster level. No bank in their right mind would approve a business loan under those conditions." She scoffed, leaning back in her chair, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her entire posture radiating defiance. "So what am I supposed to do?" she snapped, as if the fact that I wasn't immediately offering her a solution was an insult in itself. "Get some boring 9-to-5 job and waste my life like you." I let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking my head at how predictable she was, how unwilling she was to accept that maybe the problem wasn't everyone else. It was her. "You act like work is beneath you, but the truth is, you've never actually worked for anything in your life," I said, watching as her expression hardened, knowing that she hated being confronted with anything that didn't fit the version of herself she had built up in her head. "You want success without effort, results without discipline, money without responsibility. You don't want to run a business. You want to play pretend while other people pay for it." Her face turned red, her grip tightening around the edge of the table as she glared at me, as if sheer force of will alone could make me take back what I had said. "You don't know what it's like to actually chase a dream," she shot back, her voice shaking slightly, though whether it was from anger or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. "You don't know what it's like to take risks, to put yourself out there, to actually try instead of hiding behind contracts and numbers." I exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to shake my head, knowing that no matter how much she claimed otherwise, she still didn't understand the fundamental difference between us. "Taking risks isn't the same as being reckless," I said, keeping my tone even, knowing that she would dismiss anything that sounded even remotely condescending. "I spent years building something sustainable, making smart investments, planning ahead instead of hoping for some magical breakthrough. You think success is about luck, about some big moment where everything suddenly falls into place. But the truth is, real success comes from consistency, not grand gestures." For the first time, she didn't have a quick response. She looked down at the papers in front of her, her nails tapping against the tabletop, her mind working through what I had just said, as if some small part of her knew I was right, but wasn't ready to admit it. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice quieter, more uncertain than I had ever heard it before. "What am I supposed to do now?" she muttered, the frustration still there, but now laced with something closer to resignation. I hesitated, considering my next words carefully, knowing that whatever I said would determine whether this was just another fleeting moment of self-awareness or the beginning of an actual change. "Start over," I said simply, watching as she slowly looked up at me, something wary in her gaze. "Not with another half-baked business idea, not with another request for a loan you can't afford, but with actual work. Learn skills that matter. Build a real foundation instead of chasing shortcuts. You can keep blaming everyone else for your failures, or you can do something about it. But that's your choice." She didn't argue, didn't roll her eyes, didn't storm out of the room in frustration. For the first time in her life, she actually listened.